Shan, thank you for taking the time out to do this interview with India Global Business. I'm delighted to have this conversation with you today.
Thanks, Ishita. It's great to be here and really looking forward to our interview.
Yeah, I was really interesting. I was checking out your bio and I read that you had a rather fascinating journey. I'm sure you've answered this question before, but I was just wondering how does that happen? How does that transition happen from leading Zynga? I believe you're the India head for Zynga, which is a video gaming company of Farmville fame. So from virtual vegetables to e-commerce and food tech in India. How does that journey happen?
So it's fascinating. I mean, I started my career as an engineer, been in the Valley for most of my professional life in New York and San Francisco, and mostly with early stage companies. So I joined my first company, which was about 20 people when we started, and then we went public in NASDAQ in early 2000. And then by the time I left them, I was their enterprise CEO. Then I've done a bunch of different cybersecurity companies and others. And in 2009, I joined San Francisco as one of the early employees at Zynga. Right, I was the general manager on Farmville, so I created Farmville. So I don't know if you played Farmville or any of those games, but then you can attribute a lot of your time to me. And it was fascinating. But in 2009, then I relocated to India as the India CEO for Zynga, and I ramped up a team and got them up and running. And it was one of the best tech teams there. But when I was in Bangalore, this was time when I had kids, right? And we became pretty, like everybody in their stage of life, careful about how we eat, the chemicals in the food, and we were very aware of that. And Bangalore is a really bad place, at least in 2012, to get good fish and particularly chicken that does not have antibiotic residue. So I used to buy from a company called C2Home.com, which is started by my current co-founder Matthew, and he was shipping it fish particularly from Cochin to Bangalore and Delhi. And it was an amazing product, but the joy did not last long as he had to shut it down. I mean, he knew his fish, he was a fish exporter, but didn't quite know how to scale an e-commerce company. And so when that happened, the only logical course available to a foodie like me was to join hands with him, take him towards entrepreneurship. And then we scaled and created a company called FreshToHome. That's how a techie from the Valley, ended up selling fish in India.
Well, it's definitely an exciting sector. I mean, food tech is fairly recent in India. It's certainly seen a spike now, but it wasn't really something that was commonplace in India a few years ago. And I was wondering, what were some of the challenges that you encountered in setting your brand apart and scaling up in this market?
So listen, India is like, I don't know, about 100 years old in terms of supply chains, right? I mean, the fish supply chain would perhaps not have been innovated in the last so many years, right? India has got about 5,000 harbors, right? That's more number of harbors and fragmentation than any country in the world. And we use a lot of traditional fishing boats. So what that means is that for a fisherman, particularly a poor fisherman, to sell his produce, to reach a consumer in a city like Bangalore, you have to depend on 3 or 4 middlemen. So the biggest innovation that Fresh2Home bought was that we saw that there is a huge, large market, but at the same time, the consumer's experience was subpar because you had to rely on these middlemen, and the middlemen were people from the unorganized segment because most of this produce, by 99.7%, what sells through wet markets. And essentially, food safety and prioritizing food safety when you change 4 middlemen in the supply chain from the fisherman to the farmer to the consumer is really hard. So what we did is that we introduced technology, and we have a US patent around a technology that does virtual auctions. So, the process of procuring from individual fishermen, we gamified it, and we also bought technology into it, particularly AI-based technology. And the farmers and fishermen are now able to auction their produce with that, right? They're digitally auctioning it. In that process, we cut off middlemen, we give higher price to the fishermen and the farmers. And we also give a much more quality produce that gets shipped in 24 hours versus sort of 3 days and across 3 middlemen in the previous supply chain. So that's the biggest innovation that Fresh2Home bought. The result of that is a produce that's 100% fresh and 0% chemicals. That's really our brand guideline because we don't add any kind of chemicals because we control the supply chain, right, through the sellers or the vendors on our platform. So that's essentially the innovation, we bought into it, and it was pretty instrumental in a huge growth because this is a product that was unheard of, and it was at a mass market price.
You talked about, the sort of highlight of your brand being organic and chemical free, or is it just chemical free? Am I sort of just bringing the organic?
I don't think there is a thing called organic in fish, particularly marine fish, which is eating all kinds of things in the water, right?
Yeah.
It is organic like in the sense that there is no preservatives, and we test for about 120 antibiotics and a bunch of different parameters, and we certify and put that up on our site.
Right. Sorry, thanks for correcting me. So how does that work in terms of in India? Have you found, again, these whole tags of chemical free, organic when it comes to vegetables or poultry? Again, it's a fairly new concept in India. How have you managed to sort of get into that market and create this sort of awareness and this brand recognition?
So the primary thing is that we know where the source of the fish comes from, right? Because we've given technology to the sellers on the platform, and so we understand down to the boat from which the fish is actually sourced, right? And most of the contamination and the preservatives and everything else that gets added is in the supply chain, because you're trying to take a supply chain for a product that's intended to always be between 0 to 4 degrees centigrade, and you're trying to stretch the life of it across 3 days in a traditional supply chain. And that's obviously hard to do that without adding an ammonia or a chlorine or a formalin or something of that sort. Because of the fact that we don't need that kind of a shelf life, and we can actually do this within 24 hours to 36 hours. We only use ice and refrigerated supply chain, right? So that's the first part of it. The second part of it, and there's a lot of produce that's actually contract farmed on the platform, and this is directly under our guidelines and supervision. So and in Bangalore, for example, the poultry comes from the farms in Kolar, and so that end-to-end supply chain and visibility is the key reason why we are able to stand by the claims of no preservatives or no chemicals. And we've stayed true to that, and we've been able to create a brand that's well known for it. The way that we've been able to convince consumers is through certification, right? So if you go to our website, you are able to then download the certificates of the latest batch of chicken that has been tested, or the fish that has been tested, or the mutton that has been tested, and we tell them, hey, here are the 10 or 100 different things that we test, and what are the parameters in it. So we've done that through a combination of talking about the source, talking about the certification process, and then fundamentally, when a consumer tastes it, they will know the difference, right? I mean, there is definitely a difference between a 3-day-old fish versus a 24-hour-old fish, right? So it's a quite a visceral feeling when you taste.
We're talking quite a lot about supply chains, and it just makes me think about the pandemic. I mean, that's something that's on top of everyone's minds, and it has caused a lot of disruption in value chains and supply chains. Although paradoxically, it has also seen a spike in e-commerce. So how have you managed to sort of strike that balance? Are there any particular challenges that you faced, and how did you sort of...
It's been quite challenging to operate during the COVID times. I mean, the COVID is not just a medical crisis, it's also an economic crisis, right? The fishermen, the farmers, getting their produce, especially in a place like India where the product is always auctioned in a large harbor with a lot of people and with social distancing norms, it's been very hard to do that. So thankfully, some of the alternatives we've been able to provide is a virtual auctions, right? So being able to take a produce and then auction it, digitally and in a safe manner. From the consumer perspective, that's really where it gets more interesting, right? We've introduced all the safety protocols and so on. But at the end of it, there is always a fear when you go to a wet market, and we have now been able to alleviate and give comfort that fear because every process in our end is certified. We are hygienically packaging it, vacuum packing it, and then we are certifying it, and then we're delivering in a contactless fashion. So this has led to a huge growth for us. Interestingly enough, the pre-COVID and COVID times, we've grown about 3 times, right? And the last 12 months, we've grown about 4 to 4.5 times. So we are seeing a huge adoption of an online buying behavior from what used to be a typically largely wet market behavior. And I attribute a lot of that to safety and a lot of that to the convenience and the assurance that we can give as a brand.
Let's talk about a little bit, because this is a question I've been waiting to ask about the recent partnership you've entered with Abu Dhabi Investment Office. They've picked three startups, and Fresh to Home was one of them, to help boost UAE's agri-tech capabilities. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What are some of the
Sure.
details of
So
that?
one of the things that we do really well in India is that we've got a really large R&D team, right? And the R&D team is able to do, and this is, some of the top-notch scientists in the aquaculture field and people who understand nutrition, hatcheries, and the entire process. And on the basis of this, we now have a fair amount of contract farming on our platform. Right? We do about 2,500 tons of fish farming on the platform. And it's outside shrimp that could be one of the largest sort of organized farming that's happening in carbs or basa or green dory or the other products there. So, and through this process, we've developed both technology as well as expertise to be able to do fish production at a reasonable cost. Because to be able to give a product in India and still match the external price, it has to be a very scalable production. So, and this includes aquaponics and different stuff around, technologies and processes around aquaculture, along with distribution through e-grocery, right? So it's a fully vertically integrated supply chain. So Abu Dhabi ADIO has been looking at figuring out how to secure food security of the nation, and particularly being a largely desert country, bringing in technologies that are careful about resources, particularly water as well as cost and the others, is very critical for the region. So they were able to identify the technologies that we used, particularly on aquaculture as well as the e-grocery and the commodities exchange technology, as being critical to the food security of the region. So they've invested in us, and we've also invested in them to be able to bring similar technologies to Abu Dhabi, and that's the genesis of the partnership between Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and FreshToHome.
And are you seeing any opportunities in the agri-tech market, or the food tech market in the UAE, that you feel that you can tap into, or other Indian companies can tap into?
Yeah, I feel like it's a natural extension for a market for a company like us, because supply chain is our strength, right? And we are able to use that, leverage that supply chain in UAE, because if you look at it, the UAE has imported about 85% plus percent of its fish, right? And because the local production is smaller. And hopefully that'll change over time. We will have more local production, and that's one of the things that we are enabling. But also our current supply chain, whether it's our supply chains from strength from India or the others, is equally valuable for a country like UAE. So I would urge different companies who are looking at UAE to first look at their strengths. And if you have some strength like what we have from India-based exposure, to definitely consider the UAE as an opportunity. I mean, it's a virgin market. It's got tremendous potential. The consumption and average order values are much higher than India. And also the density of population is much higher, making it easier for an e-grocery or an e-commerce play. Because e-commerce, particularly on reducing the cost of last mile logistics, requires a dense population, right? And that's really what we have in the UAE. And so it's really suitable for online or similar sort of business models to come into the UAE. The country is also very welcoming and very pro, entrepreneurs. And in fact, we've been very, very grateful and thankful for the number of investors, particularly ADIO in the UAE, for heralding us and welcoming us and getting us started in Abu Dhabi, where we're investing both technology as well as brain power, right? Because both of those are intrinsic elements of bringing a business to the UAE.
And what about post-COVID plans for Fresh to Home, Shan? I mean, obviously the UAE market is one of your target markets, but are there any other markets that you've got your eye on?
Listen, I'm sitting on one of the largest markets in the world, right? India. So we're just getting started. We've just touched the tip of the iceberg in India with Bangalore and a few cities. So India still remains to be our largest market. So we are now about to launch in Hyderabad, and then going to Calcutta, and then the other different markets in India. Along with that, we are also going internationally. So UAE is one of our favorite markets. So we're going much deeper there. We are also planning to expand into Saudi Arabia. It is an adjacent market with similar characteristics as the UAE. And that's another market we're getting in very shortly. And on a horizontal basis, we are adding more products. So we've always been focused on fish and meat. Now we're also adding fruits and vegetables. It's a big part of our overall fresh to home story because it's all about fresh, preservative free, direct to your home, right? And that's a big part of what we do.
Shan, for my final question, and I must apologize, this wasn't in the list of questions I sent you, but I am very intrigued to ask because I'm sensing this intense drive towards natural, chemical-free, organic sort of produce, more sustainability in the ethos of your company. As a company that deals with this, what are your thoughts about, the kind of we are looking at a lot of pollution, particularly if you deal in fish products. There's so much plastic pollution in the oceans. It's really difficult. There's a lot of plastic contamination happening. What are your thoughts on terms of CSR or kind of a strong role that businesses such as yourselves can play towards sustainable development and growth in the market?
So we are actually after two exits in the valley, right? And particularly in companies like Zynga, which is one of the largest IPOs in the history of tech. My big interest was to do something at the grassroots level, right? Because if you look at the lives of the fishermen and farmers, right, they are essentially very cyclical. In 2 months in a year, it's when there is a trawling ban. These folks do not have some of the even sort of essential sort of livelihood. And you're talking about 14 million fishermen, which constituted about 1% of India's GDP. So it's a huge, big problem. And we are glad we're able to do our part in terms of education, better prices, and also bringing them into an organized sector. It's a big part of what we're doing. Additionally, if you look at it in terms of food wastage, the traditional food wastage is about 15% in the fisheries industry, right? From the time that the fish lands in the boats to the consumer. So that distribution chain is quite old and antiquated. And that supply chain is really where we have innovated. And our wastage is about 1.5% of the platform, right? So you just imagine in a country where food is a quite hard thing given our population increase, having sort of that kind of an impact, and that's thanks to technology, thanks to cold chain, thanks to sort of being able to plan and figure out the sale process. Those are the kind of new innovations that I fundamentally believe can change the course of sustainability, right? And we're glad that we are one of those companies that were recognized by the Prime Minister of India as part of the Champions of Change program, because that's a key part of why we were honored, because of the kind of impact we're providing at the grassroots level. And so, we're doing our part, and we just believe that both sustainability and a commercially viable enterprise can all go hand in hand. And that's really a big part of what we're doing.
Shan, thank you so much for taking the time out again to speak to us. I had a fantastic discussion with you here today. You've given me a lot to think about. And I'm sure our viewers as well will really enjoy this interview and take home a lot of things to, think about and sort of probably learn as well from your experiences in the UAE market. And I'm going to I do look forward to seeing Fresh to Home's journey forward.
Thank you, Ishita. This is a fun time. Thank you again.